Mark, that was Metallica Blackened from the record And Justice for All, which means we must be in what year?
1988, the year I was mowing lawns.
Yes.
13 years old. I had that tape and I used it in my Walkman on the riding lawnmower quite a bit.
So you were a little bit more advanced than me because other than like occasionally seeing the video for One, because I was 10 years old in 1988, and I kind of thought like the video for One was like sort of uneasy as a 10-year-old. It was like
it's pretty intense for a 13-year-old.
Yeah, I couldn't take my eyes off of it, but yet like I was really unsure if that was like territory I wanted to enter into.
Well, especially all the clips from Johnny Get Your Gun.
Yeah,
which is pretty. I mean, a guy that's basically had all of his limbs blown off and he just wants to be killed, but he can't communicate it. I mean, that's pretty heady stuff for a kid.
One of the great World War I anti-war novels for sure, but Metallica, I don't know, we'll talk more about Metallica in just a second. So welcome of course to the Requiem Metal Podcast, and this is our number 9 most crucial, influential year from Mark and I's perspective in our great vast countdown to episode number 100, the most important, crucial year in our humble opinions,
on our personal,
and they're very humble
taste.
Yeah, and this was a year, just to sort of, before we talk more about Metallica, where from a historical point of view, the People versus Larry Flint, where Hustler magazine successfully defeated that
Jerry Falwell, the
dirty bastard,
awful waste of space.
To some Middle Eastern things are kind of going on. The Soviets finally pulled out of Afghanistan
after like 8 years or
thanks
something.
to the help of Tom Hanks and Julie Roberts.
Oh, nice.
And Charlie Wilson's war. And then the Iraq-Iran war came to an end after more than 1 million people died. And what's cool about that war is we sold weapons out front to Iraq, and then we sold weapons secretly to Iran in hopes that they would both kind of kill each other.
Was that when we were selling, or we were basically installing the Taliban?
No, that was Afghanistan.
Okay.
In a sense. But what's interesting...
I'm just thinking from Rainbow 3.
Oh, yeah, that was Afghanistan,
okay.
Rainbow 3. But what was interesting about that war as well is that's when we sold Saddam Hussein weapons of mass destruction.
Hey.
And that's why we knew they were there, except we were selling like kind of old, crappy, like run-down 1970s versions because we're like, screw it. The funniest thing about the Iran-Iraq war is that they both found out that we were selling weapons to each other, to both sides.
Yeah.
And even though Saddam had been our ally, that kind of pissed him off that we were like secretly selling weapons to Iran to kill him.
I thought Saddam was just this evil guy that completely came to power on his own hand and was just completely evil.
Oh.
You mean we had something to do with this?
No, we never did. Never did. Not in the Middle East. Super Mario Brothers 3 came out.
Oh, that's right.
I was roller skating personally in 1988. You said you were
3 years previously. I was shooting the duck too. So
yeah, I was definitely roller skating a lot to Belinda Carlisle, Heaven is a Place on Earth. But
thinking about girls.
But in terms of cultural sort of things that were sort of happening as well, this was kind of the era that was dominated really by 2 records from my perspective and Mark's perspective, I think as well. This was kind of the Def Leppard Hysteria, Guns N' Roses Appetite for Destruction. Those were sort of that made up my world.
I was calling in the radio station when they'd have like, okay, what's your favorite song off Appetite for Destruction? Paradise City. Okay.
Yeah. 2 of the first tapes I ever broke, and unfortunately we can't throw them in this countdown. I would have probably made a pretty big argument for Appetite but technically it was put out in 87. It just they were slow burners actually. So
I actually had a recording of me on tape calling the radio station and getting on the air.
That's pretty sweet. That's pretty sweet. In terms of records that won't be played but are worth mentioning,
for sure.
That came out in this year, you had Candlemass Ancient Dreams, which is one of Mark's favorite Candlemasses.
It's the first one I ever heard.
LA Guns debut, probably one of the greatest sleaze metal records ever done, with Bitches Back, great song. I wish we had time to play it. Megadeth's third full length, So Far So Good, So What. Kind of a real weird hit or miss kind of record. It's very disconnected. But St. Vitus, Mournful Cries. You had the first Sadist record, Steve DiGiorgio's band. Illusions. Winger, if you're a Reb Beach fan out there. Violence, Eternal Nightmare.
Violence,
yeah. Tormentor.
Was it Rob Flynn on that? Right?
Yeah, Rob Flynn. And I'm a closet Machine Head fan. At least 2 records. Their first one and their last one. Tormentor, Anno Domini for those cult
some
black
good
metal.
Yes, good Hungarian black metal there.
Armored Saint, Overkill, Under the Influence, Bon Jovi, New Jersey. We wanted to play Cold Lake from Celtic Frost, but we just ran out of time in the 11th hour. Cryptic Slaughter, Stream of Consciousness, probably one of the more fun records that we thought about playing. Death Angel, Frolic Through the Park, and Bored, pretty funny song. Ram It Down, Judas Priest. Kings of Metal from Man of War. Jesus. Living Color, Vivid, which featured Cult of Personality.
You know what? I wanted to see that concert so bad my parents wouldn't take me.
Really? Yeah. I was too young to go to concerts at that
I was like 12 and my dad looked at the album and he's like, no.
The very god-awful No Rest for the Wicked from Ozzy, and then How Will I Laugh Tomorrow from Suicidal Tendencies. So there was a lot of stuff kind of going on. This is also, I think, kind of the birth of hip-hop, too, and we'll talk more about...
the birth of, I guess,
not the birth of hip-hop.
Politically conscious gangster rap,
yes,
as it would later be called.
The more aggressive stuff, like the debut of Public Enemy and NWA. So. But... what are we going to play? Well, we have obviously, if we're not playing so many of those great records that we just mentioned, boy, we must have some really good stuff lined up for you.
Well, this kind of falls more in line with the extreme metal genre that we usually focus on. So,
records that just kind of, like a lot of those records we just mentioned, they're good records, but they didn't really have like long-term impacts per se in the metal realm.
Well, and even if these don't necessarily have recognizable impacts to other bands, these were things that got us into the scene. Sure. And I think kind of means something to us, even if they don't necessarily kind of they're not seen as like seminal records in the scene by any means. So, and
the tune like Blackened, I mean, that takes me back to like early high school and middle school, late middle school, early high school. I remember listening to that on cassette tape quite a bit, mowing lawns, just as you were saying, and also my very first summer before high school, going to cross country camp up at Boy Scout Woods. Cross country camp was a very formative experience for me because I was there with like seniors and I wasn't even in high school yet, and stuff. So it was like a big cultural like assimilation kind of thing, and we listened to that in our cabin all the time. But I was a Johnny latecomer to Injustice for All because it was like it was just not they were probably a little too much for me, and I
can see that. Yeah.
At 10 years old they were. Yeah. And my funny Metallica story is that I went to church for 1 year when I was in third grade, and it was a very awesome brainwashing experience. Where people were
Catholicism?
No, definitely not that.
Speaking in tongues kind of stuff?
Yeah. I don't know if there was any of that crap going on. I just, did whatever you do when you go to church. I just, whatever, looked at stuff. But I kind of had a hunch that I didn't dig it. But I remember, like, I was kind of brainwashed a little bit. And I remember being at school in, like, third grade and seeing a kid with a Metallica shirt and walking up to him being like, they worship Satan. And now I think about it, and it just makes me laugh.
That's so ridiculous.
And I think that's the moment, like, I almost had an out-of-body experience at that moment, and I said, whoa, I got to get out of church, man. What the hell is this crap? So it was good. It was a good experience. And so I think back to that moment where, like, I thought Metallica was truly like, oh, man, and people are scary listening to Metallica.
That's the area the era where they were probably like the most socially conscious. Too.
Yeah. And that's just kind of ironic because of all, this was a, like, almost, like you said, like a very forward-thinking record, both lyrically and musically, and all these things. And one of the things I think that dominated this era from a metal perspective, and we'll sort of get into it with the next couple songs, is that you started to see a more complex approach to songwriting from a metal perspective. A lot of the bands, like even the big four thrash bands, were starting to make like less speed and more like technical kind of stuff and more longer epic kind of songs, and certainly Injustice for All is like a prime example of that. The stories are abound. This is the first record they made, obviously, after Cliff Burton died tragically, and so there's a lot of legend about that record, but it really did put Metallica on the map for people like I think you and I, who...
Oh, yeah. I mean, I heard of them beforehand, but it was always something that I didn't know how to get the tapes.
Yeah,
I couldn't buy them at Kmart.
On the radio very much, and, and all of a sudden there's this video on MTV, and it was like, boom, the floodgates, I think, opened for, like, heavier music in the mainstream, in a sense.
And double bass.
And double bass, yeah. And so that's why I think it was a good song to kind of kick off the show, because I think it's the defining record of this era, even if it's not like the best record. It's the one I think that maybe had the biggest like ripple effect on people like us, who are in that like threshold of like listening to like Motley Crue, and all of a sudden you like hear one and you're like, Oh, okay. This is like the next step.
Tough.
This is the next step, the next evolution. But,
well, and this was kind of like one of the albums that kind of started on that whole, the big fours, like everybody put out like their like pinnacle records at this point too.
Yeah, yeah. Everybody's putting out their long form epic songwriting.
Rust in Peace, Persistence of Time.
Yeah, I mean even like Seasons in the Abyss to some extent. It's like Slayer's kind of like longer songs, that kind of thing. So we kind of wanted in the opening set to kind of talk about bands that were, I guess, maybe pushing the envelope. And I think we've decided on a series of bands that are going to push the envelope in two different directions. And we'll talk about the first direction and then play the set of music. And then Mark will certainly tell us quite a bit about the other direction that is being pushed in this era, because it's worth spending some time on. But the next two bands, these are, I guess, maybe more in the Hundy department, if you will. Not that Mark's not fans, but
I'm not a fan of Voivod at all. But I can respect them for
what they were.
For what they were, it just never really struck me.
And I had Dimension Hatross on tape, and I would listen to it at times. Then wouldn't for 6 years kind of thing.
It'd be like something that'd be on like a mixtape, and I'd always skip past it.
Yeah, and I can understand it because they're an awkward band in a way. But certainly bands like Voivod and Queensrÿche, at least in this era, had a massive influence, I think, on the whole thinkings man metal kind of community, just like Injustice for All did, I think, in its own weird way. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I think what I think records like this did is they're coming out on the heels of Girls, Girls, Girls and Look What the Cat Dragged In, and they're adding a tiny bit of credibility, I think,
the stuff they had
to metal.
Basically no substance. Yeah. But it was just having fun.
Sure.
Music.
And a record like Dimension Hatross from Voivod, sort of the great, Canadian, I don't know, tech prog metal, whatever the heck you want to call them, just weird.
They're kind of undefinable.
Yeah, every record was different from them pretty much. Their early stuff was like really harsh thrash stuff, and then on this record they kind of really seemed to find their form. They're talking a lot about like the problems of technology and the sort of like.
What does Voivod mean? Do you know?
I don't. I probably should know.
We should look that up.
Yeah, it seems like something important. I don't know. No, I was going to say it's almost the same thing backwards and forward, but it's not. The logo's kind of goofy.
It's palindrome.
It almost looks like the cover of Probot, as Mark pointed out. Like maybe
that's the closest thing I got to it.
And didn't the guy from Voivod sing on one of the Probot songs?
Yeah, he did.
Yes,
Snake did.
Snake, yeah. And then you got Piggy on guitar and Away, and I can't remember the other guy's name, Blackie. So.
And not Blackie Lawless.
No, not Blackie Lawless. But we will talk about Wasp eventually. Actually, well, I'll talk about Wasp in a second before we go away. But yeah, the first two songs we're going to play here, we've got Queensrÿche, Operation Mindcrime, Spreading the Disease, and then Voivod, we're going to play Tribal Convictions from Dimension Hatross. And while Mark's kind of looking up some Voivod stuff, I'll tell you a little bit about the whole Operation Mindcrime thing, because I'm not going to go into all of it, but obviously, if you're not familiar with Queensrÿche, they're a Seattle band. They sort of got thrown into the lump of the hair metal genre in a way, but they were always like kind of above it. They
had a lot of maiden-isms. I think,
they were definitely doing a lot of the twin lead melody kind of stuff. You'll hear it in a tune like this. And Operation Mindcrime was it was pretty far-reaching in a sense, in that it was trying to be kind of like the next Pink Floyd The Wall, I think, in terms of trying to tell a big, long, complex story. And to some extent, it's a success, and in other ways, just like any record that tries to do this, it's kind of muddied at points, and the story loses itself. But I think it holds up pretty well, and this is a record I've listened to pretty consistently since the late 80s, and Jeff Tate, as Mark and I were talking about him, he's a hell of a vocalist. He's
he's fantastic.
Like an American Bruce Dickinson or something like that. He's got his own kind of style. And, they always kind of, I think, this is a band that I think ran to or played to their own kind of drummer, their own kind of unique beat, and didn't really fall into any scene.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Until maybe Empire came out, and then they kind of, wrote a lot more ballads like Silent Lucidity and things like that.
Jet City Woman, that's a pretty good song.
I like the way they approach ballads, like, Another Rainy Night Without You. I think it's just it's a good kind of warm,
it's like
sing-along kind of
they
song,
almost ended up doing what the Scorpions did, is just like do unbelievable ballads for years and years and years.
Or just so catchy, very mid-bass kind of tunes.
You can't really give them crap for it. They're so catchy.
But if you're kind of like a political minded person, just like And Justice for All, Operation Mindcrime definitely was taking a lot of swipes at organized religion. It's very Orwellian. Yeah, government corruption, the way that religion and government work together. It's
how media works with that too.
Exactly, propaganda, all that sort of stuff, and it's a weird story that involves a nun, and all kinds of other things named Sister Mary, and probably the most famous song off this record is "Eyes of a Stranger" because Headbangers Ball used to play it pretty consistently, and it's a good tune, but
they got radio play pretty fairly.
Yeah, too. And so did "I Don't Believe in Love," and quite a few songs got a little bit of radio play, and this has kind of been their bread and butter record. They've even done a sequel, and
don't waste your money on that.
Exactly. But anyway, so we got Spreading the Disease coming up, and then Tribal Convictions. And the one thing I will say about Voivod before we get out,
I do know what it means now.
Oh, what is it?
It's a Slavic term for military commander or governor.
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I don't know if that's where they got the meaning of it from.
You know what? Probably.
It's also
they're strange enough.
By Tchaikovsky.
Tchaikovsky. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. My allergies are acting up. Excuse me here.
Huh. Well, I could see that.
Yeah.
I mean, they're different guys. Harris Johns is the guy that produced this Dimension Hatross. He did a lot of stuff with Creator, so that earns him a little bit of street cred. But I think one thing you'll hear in here is the tendency towards influencing what will become like the Canadian tech death scene, like Gore Guts and Cryptopsy.
Well, and weird time signatures where it's like it's quite abrupt how the guitars will keep going on this one tangent and the drums will just completely flip to this new time signature, and it in a couple measures in, then it finally kind of hooks.
Yeah, it's so
really weird guitar tones.
Yeah, and the vocals are odd, and that's what's always I think turned
me off big time.
Yeah, and they're a little they're pretty tolerable on Tribal Convictions, but there's some songs that he's almost out of key with the music, and I think that's what people liked about them. It
was almost something to where they were so musical that it probably made sense in a free jazz kind of way, to where he was singing out of key, but it made sense with whatever tuning they had in their guitars or something. I'm sure there's some kind of weird explanation to it.
And Voivod's always had a cult following, the same way that Rush or which is speaking of Canada, but or even King's X, which is a band I've recently kind of gone back into and kind of gotten into.
That stuff really bothers me for some reason.
It's the whole thinking man's kind of stuff,
and I kind of hesitate to even use that term just because what the other stuff's for retarded people, or
I know,
and because of all the kind of a lot of people I know that Dream Theater and those types of bands, they were in band in high school, or they were ridiculed for what they like, so they glommed onto this, and unfortunately Porcupine Tree has a lot of these kind of followers as well.
Sure.
And it's just that whole kind of exclusive thing where, oh, dude, I totally get off on when he plays that inverse B or whatever the hell, I don't know.
And that's the unfortunate side effect, is that this does open up the whole 90s and even 2000s prog metal scene that becomes a pretty big scene on the back of bands like Dream Theater and stuff like that. Even though Queensrÿche drifts away from it and does their own thing, and Voivod, they get completely strange. I mean, their next record, Nothing Face, is really good, and after that it's kind of crapshoot, But the Fates warnings and all the exactly. So, anyways, we'll be quiet. But I did want to say one thing about Wasp. I said I would mention a random factoid about Wasp because two very metal events that happened in this year, which I think mark the end of 80s metal in a sense, at least 80s metal as you and I knew it as kids.
Yeah,
is Motley Crue checked into rehab.
What a bum out.
And that's going to kind of, soften the tone of the...
This was at the era where they were hanging out with Ozzy and sniffing ants and stuff?
They were doing heroin constantly and getting in car crashes. I think Nikki Sixx died in 1987 and then came back to life
was that when he was
later.
When he was injecting Jack Daniels?
Yeah.
Mainline and Jack Daniels?
And then, as I mentioned with Wasp, this is the year that The Decline of Western Civilization Part 2, the Metal Years documentary, came out. It's got that really eerie, famous scene where Chris Holmes from Wasp is laying in his pool just drinking vodka,
Oh, like water.
Oh,
yeah.
He's just talking. I'm an alcoholic. And I've got some problems. And his mom's sitting there in a lawn chair, like he's totally cool with it. Totally weird.
All he pays my rent.
Yeah, as Dave Mustaine says in that documentary, you know what? I used to drive around through LA and there were a lot of creeps. So speaking of that, then nothing more. But here's Queensrÿche with Spreading the Disease and Voivod and Tribal Convictions.
She always brings me what I need, without a beg and sweat and bleed. When we're alone at night, waiting for the call, she feeds my skin. 16 and on the run from home, found a job in Times Square, working live S&M shows. 25 bucks a fucking John's a happy man. She wipes the filth away and it's back on
We just heard Concession of Pain from Bolt Throwers, In Battle There Is No Law, Carcass's Burnt to a Crisp from Reek of Putrefaction, and of course, Napalm Death, Lucid Fairy Tale from
Lucid Fairy Tale!
From Enslavement to Obliteration. Then obviously we had Voivod and Queensrÿche before that. But those three records, Mark, this is an era of kind of the rise of the John Peel street cred,
the BBC Radio 1
stuff
sessions. Yeah, I mean, John Peel is kind of, I can't think of somebody else that was that, as far as that influential in the extreme metal scene, at least in the early days before anybody really even knew what it was. Mm-hmm. You know, this is coming out of the end of, actually this stuff was still going on, but the anarcho-punk stuff, the crust stuff, like bands like Concrete Socks, Heresy, Conflict, Discharge, of course, Doom, all that kind of stuff were huge influences on Bolt Thrower for sure. And Bolt Thrower went in and did a 4-track like cassette or something recording with BBC One. Mm-hmm. And John Peel, and upon hearing that, like hearing it on the radio, Vinyl Solution signed him for a record. And at the time, Vinyl Solution they were kind of across the board label. They'd have, you know, mainstream rock acts, goth acts, you know, crust stuff, punk stuff, all kinds of stuff. So that was kind of huge for them to, I mean, 1988, hearing, like, Bolt Thrower was one of the more, I guess, developed kind of bands too, because they were huge, and they're huge coming out of that whole D-beat crust movement. But also, like, if you really listen carefully, all their riffs are Slayer riffs slowed down.
Well, and there's some cool leads in that last song too, in Concession of Pain. You know, I mean, they definitely,
it's all based on, you know, it's like dive bomb stuff for sure. But for 1988, I mean, the first Bolt Thrower record I heard was Realm of Chaos. Unfortunately, it wasn't this one, but if I would have heard this in 1980, it would have completely blown my mind. Yeah, I would not have known what to think.
Sure. And coming on the back of the more mainstream stuff, you know, whether it was the Motley Crues, Def Leppards, or even, I guess, to some extent, the Metallicas, which were becoming mainstream at this point, these three bands in particular, I think, represent this sort of new guard that's kind of coming up. Yeah. You know, I mean, last episode with 85, we started to talk about the rise of death metal with Possess and Creator and some of the German stuff, and you know, but really it solidifies, I think, by 87, 88, it's kind of become,
especially in the
scene,
UK.
You know,
UK has more of a cohesive sounding scene, I think, than anybody else. There's definitely more. I think there's more punk influence than there is metal influence in this early stuff. Mm-hmm. It's just guys trying to take it to the next level. Like, okay, we heard, you know, Extreme Noise Terror is now doing these like barking, like death vocals and screechy stuff. Like, how can we take it to the next level? Like, Bolt Thrower was never quite as, say, socially conscious as Napalm Death. Yeah, and Carcass totally had their own agenda with the all together.
Gore, animal rights, vegan kind of stuff that was going on there. Yeah,
totally. So it was, I think, it was really, compared to like what was going on with, you know, like Repulsion and bands like Death, and where it was still all kind of, it was more goofy fairy tale based.
It was horror
zombie movie stuff. Yeah. It was like, okay, that seemed to be the obvious thing. This is almost like the more aristocratic version of that or something. It seemed definitely more, I think most of these guys did come out of the punk scene. Mm-hmm. So we've definitely got that kind of injection, basically where the two scenes kind of like collide.
Sure. Whoa. I don't know what that was. Some crying babies out there crying to Carcass and Napalm. But yeah, the two tunes we picked prior to the Bolt Thrower song, Burnt to the Crisp, is one of the more, I guess, musical songs on Reek of Putrefaction.
And Reek's, you know, going back and listening to it, it's quite accessible, I think, now. But as far as like, it shows, I think it kind of shows a little bit of where they're going to go. Mm-hmm. Eventually, a little bit more musicality, a little bit like slowing down a little bit, and they actually have, because Carcass was all, even their more like manic, kind of retardedly fast songs, it was always about whatever hook they had in it. You know?
Yeah, and they do almost like kind of find these grooves in a way, and in the midst of the chaos, you know, and that's kind of what I always liked about those early Carcass records. And then, of course, this Napalm, the lineup on it is almost as impressive as the lineup on Scum. You know, I mean, Scum had, you know, Justin Broderick from Godflesh and Lee Dorian, and Dorian's on this record as well.
And this,
but Bill Steer also is on this, as well as on Carcass, you know, playing guitar and stuff. So, as well as Shane is on this, Shane, on bass, and then probably Mick Harris.
Oh yeah. I don't know. I think it was just the four of them.
Yeah,
right?
It's just a 4-piece. So. Okay. And From Enslavement to Obliteration is more. It was more like cohesive in a way than I think Scum was, which Scum was almost assembled over the course of a couple years, you know.
Yeah, Scum
different sessions
definitely has a different feel to it. Enslavement's not always my go-to record.
No, it's kind of more difficult. It's almost like The Return from Bathory. It's just like kind of a weird...
It's not produced very well. It's, I mean, there's a lot of like energy and everything to it, but it wasn't necessarily... And I guess if you put it in the context of the time it came out, it's huge, but as far as going back and retrospect,
in hindsight to all the napalm that's out there, and there's a lot of it, you know, it's not a record that you put on quite a bit. So, but we figured to put these 3 songs together kind of shows this cohesiveness, just like there was the, you know, over in America there's a kind of this almost like tech metal going on. Here you've got bands that are almost doing progression in the opposite way, deconstructive, you know, like what's more punk, what's more like, you know, extreme than like just destroying the songs almost and attacking structure.
What Carcass was doing, I mean, none of them really knew what the hell they were doing on their instruments. And even some of the old videos, I think if you get the reissues, they have some videos, like some live performance videos. And Jeff Walker, I mean, because they're poor, like, crust punk kids too, you know?
Yeah.
So they had like, you know, he had 2 microphones duct taped together on one stand where he could go from one to do one kind of vocal. Well, they had 2 different effects. So he couldn't switch back and forth between the pedals. So it's pretty interesting stuff.
The DIY, you know, do it yourself. So, so those bands, I think rumor has it we're probably going to hear from them in some of the other 8 years that we have.
I would certainly hope so.
Yeah. So you haven't heard the last from these 3 bands by any means.
That's actually Battle There Is No Law. That's my favorite Bolter logo.
Is it?
Yeah, I think it's pretty badass.
That's pretty cool. What are those little demon horn looking things?
They're swords. I have no idea what the hell they are.
Pretty cool stuff. We've got coming up, though, a couple of thrash titans on the way. And I think this was a record that we're going to start off with, which is Slayer's South of Heaven. This record, I don't know. I can only imagine having come off of Rain and Blood. And again, I wasn't a Slayer fan at this point, and now I'm such a huge Slayer fan as well as you are, that it'd be weird to think about what the anticipation must have been like. Kind of, you know, how do you top perfection in a way in the eyes of what the public was,
and really
was
how,
sort of looking.
I don't.
How do you go faster and more extreme and all that kind of stuff?
What was the reception of Rain and Blood? Was it as?
I think it was big.
Was it as revered then as it is now, though?
I think that and Master of Puppets were sort of seen as like peaks in a way, and I think people didn't really know, you know, what Metallica did with Injustice for All made sense, and I think Metallica had free reign to get away with it because Cliff Burton's dead. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like they were free to almost like kind of rebirth themselves. Whereas I think the expectation was that Slayer had pushed the envelope so far with Rain and Blood in terms of speed and complexity and even like shock value that, you know, I don't think they could have gone into that direction anymore.
It was kind of the perfect move.
Yeah.
Like, let's slow down. Let's become a little bit more epic and atmospheric, I guess.
Yeah, and heavy, you know. And not to say that Rain and Blood isn't heavy, but South of Heaven has a bottom heaviness to it, like a darkness that's...
It's got a completely different production value to it, I think. Yeah.
And you hear it in this song, Read Between the Lies, which is kind of a... it's not one they play live very much, but I
the drums
appreciate it.
Retardedly hard to play.
Oh yeah. Plus, it's got some little great lyrics and some critiques of religion, which, you know, Slayer never does. So,
of course not.
You know,
you'll see.
But it's got a line in it where he says, you know, there is no heaven without a hell. And I was joking around with Mark that if I had actually Grindcore Coon, I had actually put together anything remarkably. Like a semblance of an album, I wanted to really title our first record. There is no heaven.
Well, you may not believe it, but Satan wouldn't lie.
Yeah, that's a good line. So save me. Great. Anathema actually did a really cool cover of this.
They did.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty hit for
the
them.
Satanic Slaughter 2, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was part 2. And then coming off of this great record, South of Heaven, we'll have a Testament song from the New Order. And New Order's their second record, and again, thrash metal titans. We talked a lot about Testament a couple years back when we did the Testament show, but this is maybe my favorite of the early Testaments. But
what was your entry point to Testament? Because I was listening to a lot of thrash stuff, and then heard Practice What You Preach.
Okay,
and this
was the first Old Testament I heard. Was New Order,
but not when it came out.
No, not when it came out.
Because this was these Testament's one of those bands that I immediately loved everything that I heard from, and went back and bought all, unfortunately, on cassette tape. Yeah, and had to rebuy it on CD 20 years later. But everything about him was like, man, they're doing everything that I like about every other thrash band, but just a little bit better.
Yeah.
Like Chuck Billy's vocals, I absolutely loved his vocals. And
well, I think Chuck Billy and like Araya were probably the most heaviest in terms of like the deepness of their vocals out of all the thrash.
Yeah,
guys,
but then Chuck Billy could go and do like some pretty like really good ballads.
Sure.
Like he had a good voice all around, which is kind of crazy.
Return to Serenity, and I mean even
because you got like with Exodus with like Paul Baloff, he's like. He has his charms, but he is not a well-versed vocalist by any means.
He's kind of out of control. Which
Mustaine is
snarly.
He's snarly. He's very kind of, I think, hard to get into for a lot of people.
Belladonna's kind of falsetto, a little bit too much for some people.
He's a square trying to go in a circle hole.
Yeah.
But for somehow in Anthrax it works, and I think. With
Hetfield's kind of just got the normal gruff kind of thing.
I always really like Hetfield a lot, but as far as being the total package, I think Chuck Billy really kind of encapsulated that. And this is one of those bands. It was kind of like a pleasure to discover them a little bit later, so that I could go back and find all that stuff again.
And obviously, they're one of the few that's still putting out relevant material today. So you got to.
I think they're the only ones that are putting out relevant material today.
I would say Slayer though. That last.
Slayer, for sure. For Slayer, Testament, even Exodus to some extent.
Yeah,
as far as like sticking to what they've done, they never had that completely fall off the wagon point like Metallica and Megadeth did.
Sure. And one last thing before we go into this tune from South of Heaven, and then we'll go into Testament's Trial by Fire. I want to mention about South of Heaven. This is this might be my favorite Slayer.
Really?
This and Seasons, maybe. Yeah. I know the.
I'd say Seasons and Rain. I don't even know. Because I like the old stuff a lot.
It just depends on the mood. But this one, this was a nice record for me because when I first heard Rain, it was like too much for me, almost. And I know that sounds really hilarious because they're like my favorite band now, and I know Rain's lyrics by heart, but. I got this on cassette tape, South of Heaven, and just that it was slower and
it's more listenable.
I could get into the songs. Yeah. It allowed me to then go back and actually hear things in Rain and Blood.
Yeah, for sure.
Because Rain and Blood, the first time I heard it, it just sounded like every song bled into itself, and I couldn't tell one song apart from another.
Well, a lot of the drum tempos are really similar.
Oh, it's just it just plows. It's 29 minutes of craziness, and this I could pick out melodies and stuff like that. But anyways, we've got Slayer and Testament on the way, followed by some other nice surprises. So
this does have I listen to everything like on, well, I'll throw Slayer on, I'll just listen to it consecutively. I don't know even remember what songs are on what, and I was always a big fan of Behind the Crooked Cross too.
It's a good tune. It was a good tune. We could have played that one as well, but we're due for a Slayer show down the road sometime.
We just have to come up with an interesting way to approach it, I think.
Exactly. But alright, so enjoy Read Between the Lies from South of Heaven and Trial by Fire from A New Order.
You claim God speaks through you. You restless not full of life, you popularity. You can't afford the old that suffer. With empty pockets cry from hunger. Pitiless from the generosity. Sharing the money to quench your greed. Searching for the answer to their prayers. They cry the one last wish of need. Save me! And breathes in me. The Almighty transformed to your screen. The meaning's lost in its translation. The holy words describe his deception. You say you help us find the Lord. Tell me, preacher, how do you know? A simple quest for a visible Savior to lead us through a final prayer. Save me! Contribute to the cause. Luxury is your righteous reward. Praise the Lord, praise took the heavens nearby. You may believe it, but Satan won't fly.
Next are Ministry's The Missing from Land of Rape and Honey, Bathory's For All Those Who Died from Blood, Fire, Death, and Death's Born Dead from Leprosy. And then obviously before that we heard some Testament and Slayer. Ministry, Land of Rape and Honey, kind of the start for Ministry, where they kind of move out of the dance techno kind of stuff that was pretty awful, and they start to get a little corrosive, a little metallic.
They get dangerous. I remember seeing some of the girls I used to hang out with in high school, or maybe this was actually junior high, seeing some of the Ministry videos or like live videos or concert videos and stuff where people were like, they're basically surrounded, like Blues Brothers style, where they're surrounded by a cage and people are throwing bottles and shaking. I was like, I don't ever want to see them live. That scares the crap out of me.
Well, in the way that when I looked at and I even looking at like a cover, like the cover to Land of Rape and Honey and stuff like that, they have very much almost like a David Lynch meets extreme metal sort of feel. There was like this whole uneasiness to Ministry and this sort of unhinged and they were a weird band because they were a crossover band. Like you said, girls were into them. Like, you didn't have to be a metal fan to like get into Ministry, but yet
I think it's probably where their roots came from, and that whole weird scene
that industrial UK goth metal kind of scene.
But then people that were into 4AD bands were into them. Yep. It was weird how everybody kind of like got into them for some reason.
And this is a cool record, and I think the song most people are most familiar with is Stigmata, but we decided to just kind of throw a curveball out there because I think The Missing and Deity, all three of those songs are very heavy and in your face and very predictive. And we'll be hearing more from Ministry definitely a little bit later. So, but and obviously industrial metal became a big deal in the 90s, and so this is hinting towards the future, and so that's why we want to include a record like that.
Pitch Shifters or Fear Factories or Godfleshes
for
some degree.
For sure. And even Ministry became kind of their own kind of gods. I mean, I think Psalm
69 is a pretty perfect record.
That went platinum, and that's got to be one of the heaviest records to ever go platinum that I can even think of.
Yeah,
I mean, it just is it's oppressive.
The image of the band. I remember seeing them live where there was. I saw them at the DTE, basically like a big outdoor theater where people were throwing water. They tore up all the sod in the entire area and threw it back at the band, and they just kept kept playing, and that was kind of like a weird transcendental kind of moment.
Sure, I bet.
As, being a kid and seeing this, like, oh my god, am I gonna die? Like where there's actually like bodily harm outside of that, and like seeing Pantera, and I almost got stomped.
Well,
in
that's
the pit.
just because the fans are so crazy.
The fans are idiots for the most part there, but
and then Nine Inch Nails was another band that was kind of coming on the wings of what Ministry was sort of laying out and stuff, and then Death and Bathory. Well, we talked a lot about Bathory in the last episode 10, or well part 10 of the countdown, but Blood, Fire, Death is a much more put together and complete record than The Return was, obviously.
Yeah, I think they're finally kind of coming into, well, not finally, but I mean they've been slowly kind of progressing where they've got like the first record I think is basically it's punk rock meets Venom, and then the second record is just kind of bizarre.
It's harsh.
It's not produced well. There's not a whole lot of clarity to the songs.
And then I think this record and the one preceding it, which is Under
the Sign of the Black Mark.
Yeah, I think those are kind of masterpieces. Almost
for
perfect records. And this one kind of leans a little bit heavier towards the Norse mythology, and it's kind of has roots and ties with the Viking
well, it's warmer.
Kind of
there's actually traditional elements of songwriting put into it.
Yeah, and
it's actually, now that you listen to it, and I don't know if it's just because we've listened to stuff so much, but the production is actually pretty good. It's pretty thick and
it's a nice, warm, almost got an analog kind of feel to it,
but still has that like the incredible like oppressive harshness of Quorthon's vocals coming through.
Sure. And you heard some of that in this song as well as some kind of Viking elements. And there's it's got all the elements in a song like For All Those Who Died. And then Death's Born Dead. We've talked extensively about Death. We've devoted 3 episodes to them.
Yeah, go to requiempodcast.com, type in Death, and you'll find the 3-parters.
Not a lot to say, but this is their second full length. It's a little bit more dynamic than Scream Bloody Gore was. It's kind of their last fully formed like traditional like gore death kind of record before they start to get into social issues.
It's got a great Ed Ripka cover too.
Yeah, and Born Dead, you hear some of the more melodic leads, you hear some of the more like zombie ritual, like primitive leads, you hear kind of all the elements that you
even Chuck's vocals are kind of like, that's predictive of what's to come too.
Yep, and just a dynamic record in general, So, and these are records, obviously, I think these two records in particular are going to have a huge impact on the late 80s, early 90s extreme metal scene.
Bloodfire Death had a huge impact on the second wave of black metal, without a doubt.
Huge. Emperor especially.
Yeah.
Any band that was using keyboards to add that like epic atmosphere, Enslaved, etc., etc., And I mean, listen to all three Death podcasts to know how much influence they really had. So, all right, we're gonna close out tonight with two tunes from two bands hailing from America that, and I would argue that these two songs had less impact in 1988 and had a lot more impact in 1991, 92, and 93.
Yeah.
But, ironically, they didn't probably get the appreciation that they maybe deserve. I mean, I think Danzig's debut got a little bit of attention and Mother's played.
Well, Danzig was another one of those crossover acts where since,
because he was coming out of Misfits and
the capital that he had with Misfits and Samhain, that was just like kind of huge. So you've got the metal guys, the punk guys, and then a lot of, I think, crossover just pop people.
Yeah.
Kind of got into it as well.
And I was telling Mark, whenever I hear, we kind of hesitated, should we play Mother? We didn't play it when we did the Danzig show because it's so overplayed, but there's almost like I told Mark, it's like a post-coital like cigarette kind of thing when that opening riff comes in, like
you never it's like if I see Airplane on TV, I never turn it off.
It's just great. It just sounds good every time you hear it, and it really represents the swagger and the rock and roll meets metal thing that Rick Rubin kind of was pulling out of Danzig. And we were mentioning that Rick Rubin in this year did Danzig, South of Heaven Slayer, and It Takes a Nation of Millions to hold us back from Public Enemy, which sampled Slayer's Angel of Death on She Watched Channel Zero. So.
I wonder how much Ruben had to do with that. Probably quite a bit.
Probably quite a bit. So, and then the song we're going to play before we end with Danzig is from one of my favorite bands growing up, and still a band I'm endeared to, and very happy to hear that they're actually getting back together because I never got to see them. They're not putting on a new record, are they? I hope not. At least not now.
I saw them a couple times back in the day, and they're always. I always hated to have. It seemed weird that they were throwing in the whole alternative grunge movement when they were basically almost like a Sabbath kind of band.
Sure,
they were just a rock and roll band.
Yeah, and coming out of Seattle, like Soundgarden was with Ultra Mega OK, which is their debut full length. They had a lot more to do, I think, with the Melvins than they had to do with, like, say, Pearl Jam, and Nirvana, but. Hey, that's how marketing works, and it sold them a lot of records to get linked into that, and I'm sure Chris Cornell's not complaining,
Especially since you got to do, what was it, the last Bond movie theme?
Yeah, well, 2 ones. He did the Casino Royale one. So,
that's right, that's right.
Because I think Jack White did the last one, but anyway.
Bizarre.
I'm over it. But this tune, Beyond the Wheel, this was one, I got this on cassette tape, and I listened to the crap out of this song, and I would argue that this is hands down one of the top 2 or 3 Cornell performances. Definitely a paint peeler. And
something he doesn't do enough to my liking nowadays.
Just wails, almost like, I don't know, it's like a Halford painkiller scream, but like done Chris Cornell style. I mean, it's just,
but there's nothing holding it back.
Yeah, it's raw, and the riffing is very Sabbathy and just loud and noisy, very Melvinsy in a way too. And like I said, these are 2 records that will have a greater impact down the road, but that's why we're doing a show like this, to show that not all of these had instantaneous success, but we can kind of appreciate what they meant when they were around. So, but this has been part 9, 1988 again, and
Crucial Metal,
88. Yeah, and we got 8 more to go in the upcoming weeks. So give us some feedback. Shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. Check us out on Facebook. Mark and Jason. Leave us a comment on iTunes, or
that'd be great.
We've got donations on the website as well.
RequiemPodcast.com. If I'd love to have some of your donations.
Sure. And there's artwork up there that you can get that Mark's done for Decibel, and mugs and T-shirts and other different things, which we're actually starting to sell.
And thank you to anybody that has bought anything from our Zazzle store, because that does we get a little bit of a kickback, and that helps us with our operating costs.
And we appreciate all that. And we have to apologize for last time because we're trying to rein this in really quick if we're we're talking really fast here because the last time we kind of got out of hand a little bit and had to edit.
There's a lot of
songs out
fades, and we actually had to drop the bit rate down a little bit.
Yeah, so we didn't realize we'd have so much to say about all this. But anyways, give us some feedback. Let us know what you thought. Let us know if there was a song or a band or an era, something from this era that we missed. But this is the best that we could do, and
this is from our point of view as well.
We're happy with it. So enjoy Soundgarden's Beyond the Wheel from Ultra Mega OK and Danzig's Mother. I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark.
Mother, tell your children not to walk my way. Tell your children not to hear my words, what they mean, what they say. Mother, Mother, can you keep them in the dark for life?